Welcome to Growing E-commerce. I'm your host, Mike Ryan of Smarter E-commerce, also known as smec. Today, we're joined by a longtime colleague and friend of mine, Karin Schallauer. She's our product marketing lead here at smec. Karin just got back from K5, and if you're in the German-speaking world, that's a conference that needs no further introduction. If not, no worries. We just use K5 as an impetus or impulse to discuss some trends in e-commerce right now. That includes sustainability, social commerce, and marketplaces. I'll tell you right now, I have a skeptical view, partly on all three of these themes, yet they're so complex. I also personally find the German perspective on these topics fascinating, since, of course, we're talking about the world's fourth largest GDP and arguably the economic engine of Europe. All right, let's get into it. So, Karen, thanks so much for joining us today. Would you get us started with a quick introduction? Tell us a bit about yourself. What are your skills and what themes interest you?
Sure. Thanks, Mike, for having me. So my name is Karin Schallauer, and I'm the team lead for product marketing here at Smarter Ecommerce. I generally like to describe myself as a very curious person, and I overall love to learn and work with different departments here at the company, but also overall. And the themes that interest me very much apart from product marketing are social responsibility and sustainability topics, but also internationalization and the global economy as a whole.
Could you unpack that for us a little bit more? Why are some of those themes more interesting, like global economy, for example?
When you look at my background, I studied East Asian economy and society, and also I overall like studying countries. And when you study a country, not only the language is very interesting to me, but also the political and economic factors of that specific country and economic development over time. So that is something that I really love to read up on in my private time and watch documentaries on. So yeah.
I'll also throw in because I've known you a while, Karen. So I know you've got like a drawer of travel itineraries out there, and you love to travel
Sure,
and
yeah.
visit places. So that's cool. I think I would love to have just a secret drawer full of all the where I'm going to head next. It's awesome.
Yeah,
um,
already looking forward to my next, like, long distance traveling once all the pandemic restrictions are lifted.
Yeah, definitely. And I think we'll have a chance to talk about sustainability a bit later.
Definitely.
So yeah, why don't you tell us a bit then next about K5? What is this event about? What's the significance in the industry? Um, and maybe what were some of the topics or key themes that seem to be on people's mind this year?
So overall, for those who don't know the K5, especially those who are not from German-speaking countries, it's one of the biggest e-commerce conferences overall in the German-speaking region. Something that I learned about the conference just a few days ago is that it was originally named after one of the mountain peaks, so the K5. And this event was especially grand because we basically celebrated the 10-year anniversary of the conference. And the motto that the conference followed was basically meet the best, learn from the best, and be the best. And that's why they had a lot of interesting talks and also representatives from very different verticals of the retail industry, but also tech representatives from payment, fulfillment, shop system providers. And there was also one of the highlights for me was that it was kind of a continuation of the Female in Retail initiative that the K5 has. And well, naturally, as we are in the time of the pandemic, the event also addressed the impact of that. So I don't know how many tickets they sold in the end, but the conference was pretty packed. And not only the exhibition halls were really full, but also in front of the stage. It was sometimes really difficult to even get a seat. So there was a lot of interest in the conference, and you could see that the retailers, but also the tech providers who were present were really excited to be there. When looking at the talks already before I attended the conference, it was pretty clear that at the focus of the conference, which were mainly marketplace topics and the role marketplaces play in the retail industry, but also D2C, supply chain issues, personalization, and digital transformation as a whole. And what I also really liked is that they opened the conference talks with basically some provocative themes. that kind of opened the topics, and then they followed up with specific talks that either countered or validated these theses.
Could you give us an example of like what some of those theses were, or one of those themes statements?
I think I will get into more details later on anyway, but
Okay.
one of the theses was basically that marketplaces are dead. So
Mm.
I'm pretty sure we will have a follow-up question on that as well, and
Yeah,
then I will get into more details.
yeah, definitely. I'm very interested in a statement like that. Um, Great. So thanks for kind of introducing us to the conference, and I think it's a super interesting time. Yeah, especially hearing all these tech providers there as well. It's just e-commerce is going through. Yeah, I mean some growing pains, just this whiplash from the growth that occurred in 2020, 2021, and a bit of a cool down now. Maybe we can talk about that later on too. Um, so earlier on, you mentioned sustainability is something that's important to you personally, and I think it was also a theme at the conference. Um,
Yeah.
a lot of people have been kind of touting that as an imperative for commerce and e-commerce in particular for years now. E-commerce sometimes having a bad ecological footprint, and depending on what
Exactly.
industry you're in, more than others. So, yeah, what can you tell us about that? What are the experts saying now? What's your view on it? Love to hear about that.
Mhm. So there was one talk in particular that stood out to me, but also stood out to the audience because you could really hear that they were quiet all of a sudden and like really listening in. And that was one of the talks by the Kashdalis. She's one of the angel investors and also a co-founder of Opexia. And she was basically in her opening speech really calling for radical changes
Mm,
and also a rethinking along the whole value chain of retail. She basically advocated for a stop of promoting some kind of imaginary sales festivities and also for selling new items every season because it's
mm,
simply something that doesn't really allow for sustainability in the long run, and also to bring back items into the cycle. So to really provoke a rethinking among the clients and communities that a brand or a retailer has. And well, the key question was basically whether we want to or should grow at all costs, and whether not a shift to stable profits would be the way to go. But
mm,
throughout the day, there was also another talk by one of the representatives from ASUS, for example, who mentioned that the young generation is indeed very interested in sustainability topics. But in the end, when it comes to purchasing, then they still very often make decisions based on price and choose the cheaper item on the menu, so to speak. So there seems to
mm.
be some kind of conflict there in terms of what people are interested in theory and how it translates into real life. We'll see whether that will shift, whether people really start to take action more. And this naturally will also be a topic that retailers have to observe within their own communities, how people really react to sustainability topics and whether they are willing to pay a premium for the offer then.
Backing up, you mentioned earlier that she was advocating for getting rid of like what was the phrase, like artificial festivities or something. What are we talking about here? Sales events like Black Friday or?
Exactly. So Black Friday was not mentioned in particular, but just those hyped events that kind of like to where retailers like to draw in their audience, but it's kind of creating this artificial demand, and it's not really even necessary for people to buy those new products or so. It's just well,
Mm,
as I mentioned, artificial demand more or less. So
mm,
pushing products on the market
yes.
that are not even needed.
Yeah. So kind of a broader attack on consumerism and this kind of a
Exactly.
material culture. Yeah. That's quite interesting. And I think that ties into this radical narrative you mentioned, or growth at all costs. I mean, I think that also takes on a different light these days, where we see this kind of recession like economy right now. Um, let's see where we land on that, future listeners. But uh, yeah, I think in the last several years, it's really been just kind of this booming market in e-commerce. It wasn't only the pandemic; it's been a bull market, broadly speaking, in economic terms, in the West. And we see that now we're entering our first kind of bear market, or more uh, kind of negative market, or facing a downturn. And people are going to naturally have to turn toward profitability and accepting that flat growth is growth, or this kind of a thing anyway. I just wonder, there's that increased pressure on people and their purchasing power, and when we see inflation kicking in so strong like it is, and it's like that idea of put your money where your mouth is. Definitely young people have these values, but they're probably arguably the most under financial pressure, and they have the least
Yes.
means to pay a premium. So quite a kind of a wicked problem in a way. So, Karen, earlier you also mentioned that a thesis of the event, or a theme that they wanted to put out there, kind of a controversial statement, hot take, was that marketplaces. Um, how do they phrase it again? That marketplaces are dying or don't deserve. What was that?
Yeah, that was basically my interpretation of the thing. So it's not a word by word citation,
Yeah.
but basically the theme was more or less that the marketplaces of today will be the department stores of tomorrow. So that
Mhm.
marketplaces don't really have a very promising future. That was the narrative on the one hand side, most of all because they are not able to meet the expectations of shoppers in terms of transparency, sustainability, and also personalization. So, for example, when you browse through the big A, so to speak, then you very often don't really know who will be the shop actually sending the product to you in the end, and all those topics. But throughout the conference, there were many people who disagreed with this statement. Basically saying that the marketplaces also throughout the pandemic have proven their worth, mostly because they help retailers to generate additional demand and reach audiences that would not be able to reach with just their own online shop and within their own universe. So personally, I really think that it's about this mix, especially for brands, that they should look beyond their own online shop and to expand their reach, but not rely solely on Amazon, for example, because they would simply become like dictated by the terms of the marketplace. And it's definitely important for them to focus on the customers, on customer experience, and also building up their own community. So they basically have at least two pillars that they can rely on and don't solely sell on Amazon. And of course, there's also
Mhm.
this big topic of retailers moving into the marketplace business model. So it can definitely work for some, but of course, also not every retailer can transform now into a marketplace. That would also not really make a lot of sense. And it's important for those retailers, if they make the transition, that their USP is not only suddenly having more products on the site, but that they really stay on their brand, that they still are able to connect with the customers, and also simply that they come across as genuine, and that it really relates well to their brand and their identity.
So on the one hand, we've got this topic of these well-known scaled marketplaces like Amazon or Zalando, and how, if and how people should participate in them. And then on the other hand, this marketplace layer on top of existing retail businesses, which,
Exactly.
yeah, okay. I think it's too early to, it, I think it's too early to say that this is something that's dead, from my perspective. And I think we, going to continue to see a lot of investments in here. And one of the drivers there could be the idea of layering on retail media networks and generating additional monetization through there.
Mm.
But that's even again potentially more challenging to the customer experience when you layer advertisements in. It has to be done with a light touch so you're not destroying the customer experience. I mean, Amazon these days, it's just a wall of ads on those first page results. Um,
Yeah, I
Personally,
agree.
I find it getting to the point that yeah, it's harder to use and maybe lacking that credibility. A long-standing question is, yeah, should every retailer have a marketplace? Because again, that question of scale comes into place. Like, how big can you build this thing? How many of these can you have? And if it's just a topic of slightly expanding your reach or the range of products that you have, your product depth in a certain area can make sense. But we're not all going to be Amazon. We're not all going to be Zalando, and then
Yeah.
the question is, does it become meaningless if everyone is just adding this small layer on? I don't know if I really get or agree with the store of the future kind of thing, because I don't know, department stores. I actually don't. To me, that's not really an insult. I maybe I'm super old fashioned here, but department stores served a great need for a long, long time. And yeah, there was kind of, yeah. If you look at the Macy's in the U.S. or I think what is a good comparable example here in Europe, but they kind of got a little bit diluted in a value proposition or a good clear market position, but nevertheless they filled a super valuable niche for a long, long and a big, not even niche. They served a mass market for a very long time. So um, but yeah, maybe it's that there's this phrase from Steve Dennis that I really like, where he talks about like the collapse of the middle, where you've got these businesses that are successful at scaling up, and you've got these businesses that are successful at really finding a niche in a community,
Mhm.
um, and then the people in the middle are going to get squashed by the giants and eaten up by these more targeted and potentially better customer experience people at the bottom. So it's definitely a tricky place to navigate. Social commerce. This was a theme at the conference as well, right? So again, I just called myself a little old fashioned saying, "Hey, department stores aren't that bad."
Yeah.
um, and now, social commerce. How can we understand this phenomenon? What might we expect? Because maybe it's a stereotype, a cliche. I'm not sure, but I've seen these and read about it, and I understand there are these massively, just the scale is huge. What happens in China, for example, where you've got streamers promoting products, kind of like a QVC type product back in the days. Speaking of old fashioned, but it's hosted you know online, and there's a shopping app associated with it, and they rake in just huge quantities of money in a 2-day event. Which reminds me, by the way, now of that artificial sales event phenomenon from earlier. So maybe at odds,
Yeah,
uh, but
exactly.
but I mean, it's hard for me. I guess maybe I'm not in the demographic. I just don't know if so. I'm not convinced that social commerce is going to reach the West the same way that the level of penetration that it's had in the East, because I think that there are cultural differences here, and maybe I'm just not in the demographic. But all right, there's the end of my old man yelling at cloud rant. Now I'll take it from someone like you, much more international and cultured than myself. Tell us about social commerce.
I completely agree that it's definitely an issue of demographics, but also of culture. So overall, to those who are not really familiar with the term social commerce, it's basically about selling products via social networks. And as Mike already mentioned, it's a huge thing in China. The statistics that were presented about Germany was that 53% of companies in Germany use social media. So, well, we are getting there, but it's just a lot bigger in some other markets. And what we need to consider is that the youth of today will be among the biggest spenders in the future. So, while people like us who are in our 30s, more or less, are not the generations typically all too active on TikTok and so to speak, but they will basically dominate the buying landscape at some point in time. And we already see that, especially for young people, content creators, they have a huge impact on their buying behavior. So for some listeners, it might even sound a little bit scary, or at least a little bit foreign, that content creators have such a huge impact on buying behavior of people. But we really see that some young people, they equate influencers or content creators to friends, and are therefore more inclined to follow those recommendations, and also without much hesitation or further consideration, like comparing products or whatnot. And for companies, basically the bottom line of the talk was by HSE, which was really interesting as well. He has a background um, coming from China and working in China for quite a long time. And it was basically the statement that people or the companies, they should not really focus all too much on their own company branded social media channels, but rather invest in building up a network and allowing that network to sell for them. Because in the end, what people are interested in on social media networks, it's basically connecting with people, not connecting with brands or companies. It's all about this human to human connection. And one of the great things about social commerce is that it's very easy, more or less, to get started. There was one example about live stream events, for example, where products are showcased or products are sold. And it's very simple. You just need basically a phone and you need an internet connection, and you can get started and just try out whether it works for your audience. And then you will see whether it resonates or not, especially as we discussed in the beginning, it's a demographic thing as well. So I would not suggest to have like build up a huge TikTok follower base if your main audience is like 50 plus or so. But if you're especially aiming for a younger audience, then it's definitely the way to go. But as I mentioned, not with your company social media channel, but try to build up a network of content creators. And then the question, of course, comes in: why should they represent your brand? So you would also need a USP or narrative for those content creators to draw them in.
Yeah, it is. It is for me a touch scary that you've got young people or any people of any age looking at a content creator and not maybe with a good level of critical awareness there. I think there's this bias that comes into place where when you're exposed to somebody and their content on a daily basis, they might start to, you get this level of familiarity, false familiarity to a certain extent. I mean, they might feel like a friend to you. Um, but from their perspective, they don't know you. You're one of potentially millions of followers.
I
Um,
agree.
and, and so that there's this imbalance there that I find a bit concerning because their incentives are going to be totally different than a friend's incentives. And this, big UGC movement, user generated content,
Mm.
um, it's basically, yeah, I mean, influencer marketing. I just think there's this slipperiness there that is fascinating and possibly risky. Also, when you've got people also plugging their buy now, pay later solutions and stuff like that, and saying, "Hey, yeah," I mean, you can just imagine the situation it might get some folks into. But I'm a little skeptical too because there's a lot of social commerce offerings. I saw this great post lately from Marketplace Pulse, and they had screenshots of these ostensibly social commerce apps or these if you're in Instagram, there's a commerce app. If you're in Twitter, everything has its own commerce app now, and they're all almost just clones of each other. They feel very samey. They don't feel social, so it's a bit different than these kind of live stream shopping things. But I just I don't know. We went through the whole QVC thing before. You said HSA earlier. Is that
Exactly. Yes.
HSE Home Shopping Europe?
Yes. Exactly.
And they're very similar to a QVC, correct? For our international
Um,
listeners, or is it different? Is it a bit different?
I
Pardon my
think
ignorance.
it's very similar, but I'm not so familiar with QVC, to be honest.
Yeah. Okay. Well, QVC in the US back in the days, and I think to a certain extent internationally, there'd be somebody on the TV, and
Exactly,
um,
yes, and
yeah,
trying to sell the product and everything, yeah, and,
yeah,
it was kind of presented that they are trying to make this shift from traditional television,
mm,
to live streaming more or less.
mm,
So to have this concept more or less translated to the digital world.
yeah. I mean, that had a certain life cycle to it, and I wonder if this kind of live shopping thing is going to as well. But you see interesting things going on in the space too, like the former president or vice president of Google Shopping, Bill Reddy, formerly of PayPal. So he's deep in the payments ecosystem. He's deep in the product listing, advertising ecosystem, and commerce ads. And he's now CEO of Pinterest.
Mhm.
And so you can see that these moves continue to happen. These networks and platforms are still very interested, and I can understand totally why. The size of the opportunity is just massive. But I think to me, the whole thing just seems a bit raw, a bit overhyped. It reminds me a bit of all the hype around voice search not that long ago, and
Mhm.
which ha- you could argue to what extent that's come to fruition. But I'm going to remain skeptical. I'm still keeping my skeptic hat on.
Me too. I will also more or less stay on the skeptical train, especially because it doesn't really connect well with the sustainability topic, as you mentioned. And also, I'm kind of skeptical what it means to our society.
Mm.
So those are just the two issues that I have with this topic overall. But of course, nobody should feel discouraged by our discussion here. So if you think that you have an audience where this could actually work out, then just feel free to try it. So the entry barriers are not that high for social commerce.
For sure, there are people listening right now who are laughing all the way to the bank, as the saying goes. um, there's no doubt about that. Um, but I didn't want to start on this topic because I see a lot of conversations that start with a discussion about the pandemic, and it feels I mean, of course, I don't want to do anything to minimize the disruption that occurred there, and the human toll that occurred and continues to occur as well. But it's not my favorite way to start a conversation anymore. But now let's get into it. Like, what what was the assessment of the pandemic? How, now that we're 2 years
Mm.
in, um, what is the feeling about what happened back then in the meanwhile, and what's happening now and in the future? How do we see this evolving uh, major event of a kind of generational event? How's it playing out?
Yeah. So as we are talking about the K5 here, so there is no kind of forgetting about Jochen Krisch, and he was one of the first speakers at the conference as well, and he did a very thorough analysis of the impact of the pandemic and also what it means for retailers going forward. And especially now with the economic crisis that we're having, the main question was basically how should retailers assess their performance and what should they use as a kind of line to compare themselves now and see where they actually stand now, whether they are more on the optimistic part or whether it's not looking all too good. And basically, the main statement was that 2019 will more or less become the line now for retailers to orient themselves when it comes to performance evaluation. And basically, companies that generated more than 75% more revenue in 2022, so this year, than in 2019, they are more or less top, so on a really good track. They were typically the companies that pushed through the pandemic, so with really tough goals and also very tight schedules and everything. Or even those companies that had operative issues but were still able to complete most of the fulfill most of the orders. And for them, it's basically mostly about assessing the impact now of this economic crisis and maybe reduce some of the capacities, but more or less continue on. even though they might have to push some investments to the future. The problem is more the companies that have a growth rate of less than 50% compared to 2019. So the companies that were not able to generate all too much growth, and they really have to see that they take immediate action not to lose track. But overall, the statement was basically that the German e-commerce industry was able to react pretty fast to the pandemic, and that many of them learned a lot throughout the pandemic and are set up better now than they ever were in the past. So
Really interesting, this idea of grabbing that 2019 baseline. I think, um, yeah, there was this bubble effect, of course, and we have to, you set yourself up for a lot of pain right now when you're making year over
mm,
year comparisons. Um,
exactly,
where we're not even facing like necessarily a return to normal, but we're maybe
mm,
facing pretty challenging circumstances in the months ahead. I hope
yeah,
not. Um, but
yeah.
I
For
think
some for some retailers, the year 2021 was just a very easy one. So the sales almost happened on their own. And it's now very tough to replicate those revenue records. And for many people, it's just very difficult to interpret what this change in performance numbers now means.
definitely, I think that'll continue to be the case for a while. I mean, in the past, if you look at e-commerce growing with this kind of steady annual
Mm.
growth rate, or rather predictable, and it was just easy to make year over year comparisons, and
Exactly, yes.
it's just getting much more challenging now. And I have to remember again this statement made earlier on the topic of sustainability about growth at all costs or hyper growth.
Mm.
But in this kind of a context, it's just dizzying. It's hard to say what amount of growth do I really need, and I'm not. Is what is hyper growth? What would hyper growth look like now compared to in the past, or what is a healthy and responsible amount of growth? And it's hard. Not, I wouldn't blame anyone for trying to um, shore up as much sales as they possibly can when the future ahead is so uncertain. And it's not necessarily in the, you know, some kind of a greediness or anything like that, but just trying to prepare
Mm.
for the future. It's just super, super challenging waters to navigate right now. What are some takeaways for the future? Could you get kind of a glimpse or some predictions about where e-commerce is headed? And by the way, if they're super gloomy and bad, then that's fair game. I just our
No, I will
the
definitely
poor
try
listeners.
try to keep it positive and also kind of frame it in a way that they serve as kind of tips for our audience as well. So one of the topics that will definitely be important in the future is to focus on quality, so product quality, because no marketing campaign can really help you if the product quality doesn't really convince people. So yeah, that's one topic, but also, as we mentioned, the sustainability, to really act on sustainability and go beyond sustainability, just reduced to marketing communication, so to speak. Also, one of the trends that became really apparent was this customer experience, everything from customer data platforms to just building up communities, activating those communities, and just being very authentic in what you offer to your customers. There's also, well, digitalization or digital transformation overall. The saying was more or less is done for most companies. Of course, there's still some traditional companies out there who still need to take some steps in that direction. But now it's mostly about getting rid of all those more or less monkey tasks, so to get the processes and the operative work on track, to automate that and avoid that people spend time on unnecessary tasks that can easily be done by a machine. What we might also see is are some M&As, because now some companies, of course, that did not go through the pandemic all too well, they might be acquired or form some kind of partnerships, also for retailers to build up their um, not only customer network, but also, of course, to build up the product portfolio a little bit better. And one of the highlights for me was also the brands really representing that for them the future is not 100% digital or 100% online, that they will always focus on having something where customers or potential customers can experience the brand firsthand. So, whether that may be concept stores or just selling a limited range of their products through other stores or chains, want to connect with the community through physical products as well. And well, that was more or less the key statement, except from one that I still want to add is that there was one very interesting talk by Disruptive, Rupert Bodmeyer, who basically presented that the future, so the big players of the retail industry might not be the marketplaces or the online retailers of today, but actually the apps that are deeply ingrained in the daily lives of users. So we might see actually the next big players coming from more or less the app side, so whether it's running apps or apps helping you to optimize your diet or whatever, because they're very close to users. They are very embedded in the daily life, and they are closer to this why rather than the what. So they don't focus all too
Mm.
much on the product yet, but they are very close to just helping people optimize their daily lives. And I really like the statement, and I'm curious to see how that will actually develop.
You'll hear or read about these super apps possibly coming to the West. They're already present in the in Asia, for example.
Mhm.
And but that's a different vision of kind of like more distributed commerce through a multitude of smaller and more purpose built apps. I think it connects to some other trends you were saying, like this idea of having a genuine purpose, a strong customer experience, and so on. So I
Yeah.
find it credible in that way. That's really interesting. And I definitely agree what you were saying earlier about just having the product front and center. It's so tough because you know right now, well, if you look at what was happening with so many direct to consumer brands, they would just spin out a product and say, let's launch with this one thing. And then they were acquiring traffic really cheap, but maybe the product wasn't really that novel or it was too
Yep.
easily replicated. And soon you've got knockoffs on Amazon, and then suddenly Facebook's not working so well anymore and their lunch is getting eaten. But so it continues to be a real challenge. Is easier said than done having a great product out there for sure,
Mhm.
which you as a product marketer will surely understand. Thanks so much for joining us and sharing those insights with us, Karin. Is there
Thank you for
anything?
having me.
Oh, my pleasure. Any last words or any people, places, things, anything you want to plug or promote?
Nothing in particular to mention. I just recommend everybody to join our podcast also in the next episodes. To stay curious, and all the best with the year and coming through the economic crisis more or less.
Well, cheers to that. Thank you again, Karin Schallauer. Thanks for listening to Growing E-commerce. And if you enjoy this podcast, please consider sharing it with coworkers, friends, or within your professional network. We really appreciate it. This podcast is produced by Smarter E-commerce, also known as smec. Visit smarter-ecommerce.com.